Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first fireside chat of 2022. Appropriately, here in Princeton, we have snow outside. and, and my guest this week is Anne-Marie Slaughter, who probably lives, 3 minutes from me, maybe 5, and yet we're still on Zoom because it's snowing outside. So just as a reminder, this is being recorded for posterity, so don't say anything you don't want your grandmother finding out about or other interested parties. My guest this week is Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of the New America Foundation, but who has in her long and illustrious career done many, many other things, including an immense amount of work on foreign policy, teaching at Princeton, running the formerly called Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton for a while, and most recently author of a really terrific book called Renewal, which looks at, and we were just talking about this, the theme of both personal renewal and how that translates into political and social renewal. So maybe kind of start with the motivation for the book and why now? You know, I mean, here we are, it's a year after the insurrection at the Capitol, deep questions about who we are as a people, just a lot going on for people to absorb. And I'd just love to get your perspective on why that book, why now, what you're hoping people will take away from it.
Well, so Rita, thank you. And it is wonderful to be in conversation and to know that you're really just on the other side of Route 1. And I'm also delighted to talk to everybody listening. The fireside chat format is just a wonderful one. This book was born out of a crisis that I went through in 2017, a professional crisis that I talk about right at the beginning of the book. And after I was sort of a year in, not while I was going through it, but after about a year, I started thinking to myself, what are the lessons here? And I was growing and changing dramatically as a leader. And so I started to think about what is now the first chapter, when leadership means having to say you're sorry. And then it became increasingly clear to me that I run an organization dedicated to renewing the promise of America. As I was writing in 2020, not just the pandemic, but George Floyd's murder and the grappling that we're still doing and must continue doing with systemic racism and injustice, it hit me that there really were ways to weave together my personal story with not only the story of New America, so organizational change, but also national renewal. And I wanted to do that in a format that was new. I read a ton of fiction, a lot of modern fiction, and I'm always struck by ways that novelists weave together different themes. So I wanted to write a book that has a policy message or a national message, but that wasn't with subheads and a very clear argument marching through the chapters. That was more weaving together my experience with these other themes. And so when I got the opportunity to write for Princeton's Public Square series, which is exactly a short format for public consumption, sort of broader publics, I thought, I'm going to try to put this all together. Last thing I'll say is I think the concept of renewal is very important, and we can talk about that. But I again wanted to pack something into a book with one big overarching idea.
Well, and you are very explicit in one of the later chapters about the difference between renewal, reinvention, restarting. And I think you use the analogy of a house, right? So, the plumbing's old, you rip it out and you start over with that particular piece, but you don't disturb the foundation, you don't take the roof off necessarily. And I think that's a really interesting point of departure. And the reason I think that is that, I think a lot of change agents burn out because they basically come at societal change and say, we've got to rip the whole thing down and start completely over. And that's not at all what you're talking about. You're talking about the ability to see cumulative change, right? But not in some huge inferno, but more like piece by piece.
Yes, exactly. And to accept that we can change without question. I mean, I'm talking about transformation, but not completely. This whole new you, reinvent yourself. Americans love that, right? And particularly now, it's New Year.
New year. I'm going to hit the gym, 4 times before this.
Exactly. New year, new you. And America is the land where people came often to reinvent themselves. And yet, both individually, certainly if you're in your 60s as I am, but really at any stage of after your formative years, you are shaped obviously by your upbringing and your experiences, and you can't just rip all that out. You have to accept it. You have to face it often when you've done things that you really regret, that were wrong or bad. And similarly for the country, renewal, yes, it's not restoration. We're not going back. There were great things in our past, but there were really awful things, and it was never great for everyone. So it's not restoration, but it's also not reinvention. And renewal for us nationally means ripping out a lot of things, but also facing, like our Constitution has 3/5, defines African Americans, enslaved African Americans, as 3/5 of a man. So here we are, all men are created equal, except Black men were not even human. They were 3/5 of a man. And we're not going to rip that out. I mean, we've ripped it out in the sense it's no longer there in the Constitution, but we have to sit with it and accept it and understand how that has shaped us until now, if we're then going to be able to renew the commitment to the ideal that all human beings are created equal, and to do what we can in our time to make that real.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very important. So one of our more loyal listeners is asking about an interview that I guess you did get a few years ago about a breakdown in the social contract. And I guess, it's very fraught. Like, you can't open a newspaper or turn on the news today without some evidence that we don't trust each other. We don't believe in collective goals. People see other Americans as somehow the enemy. How does that get resolved? Like, how do we find common ground? Because I personally believe we have a lot more in common than we have that separates us, but that isn't to the benefit of many people who I guess benefit from division.
No, it's a great question. And again, you can address it at the national level or the state level, as many great thinkers are at the moment, of, a new social contract. What do we owe one another? Which is the title of a recent great book on a new social contract. How do we update the institutions, economic and social, of our society to take account of what we owe one another now? That's a social contract. And that's a really important work. There are political divisions about it, but I think there's broad agreement that so many things in our society are broken. Let's just take our healthcare system. But then the question is, okay, if that's great, I run a national think and action tank, so I'm in a position to try to do things about that nationally, but what do we do individually? And I've been very influenced by Adam Grant's book, Think Again. You and I both know Adam well. And the idea that we each have to push back against we and they. And I am certainly guilty of this. And we all are. I'm a Democrat, and I read, I'm a probably centrist, center left, I think of myself. But, I read these things about these crazy people, who believe that there was a steal and who believe that the country's under threat. And I immediately go to the they. And in conversation, I'm confident I know what they think. Well, I don't actually, right? So individually, I need to, every time I think they, I need to stop and say, wait a minute, and think about individuals whom I know, who may have voted for Donald Trump, or many others who didn't, but who are definitely more conservative than I am. And then think, I don't know what that person thinks. And if I were having a conversation with them, I need to be able to say to them, what evidence would convince you that what you're saying might be wrong? And I have to say, what evidence would convince me? And I have to be willing to admit that I'm wrong. This is the place where, that's somehow a moral defect these days in our political life. I actually think that is the only path to growth, is that I was wrong. I don't know, I need help from you. So there again is this link between personal growth and national change. But I think all of us have to take that shifted mindset into our daily lives as much as we possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned a number of examples in the book, which I think is great. And I forget what the acronym is, but it's sort of, Black people out there, right? Like,
oh, yeah.
Other people have this structural problem. We don't, our organization, not at all.
It's TROT, right?
TROT, that's the one.
TROT, those racists over there. Rita McGrath wrote it. And I described this real moment of awakening in my own organization in New America. Went right after George Floyd's murder. My president, Tyra Mariani, who is an African-American woman, now runs Howard Schultz and Sherry Schultz's foundation. We're drafting this statement and we're condemning the murder of George Floyd and we're condemning systemic racism. And Tyra looks at me and she says, every think tank in town is doing this. And I can tell you what all their employees of color and our employees of color are thinking. They're thinking it's so easy to condemn those racists over there, systemic racism out there. What about the racism in here? And, because she was my president, I'm CEO, she's president, because we had a real relationship, she could say that to me and I could hear it. And that triggered what is now a 3-year equity transformation where we are having to accept many white, although there's lots of bias in lots of directions, but a lot of white members of our staff are realizing that we have not had a culture that is truly inclusive, that has truly honored everyone as equal and allowed people to make equal contributions. And so, yeah, that was one of those moments.
Well, it really struck home to me because, like you, I'm a faculty member at a sort of left-leaning university, and we all are comfortable in our little bubble. But, I am here to tell you, Columbia Business School is not exactly a hotbed of egalitarianism.
Neither is Princeton University.
No, right, exactly. But it's a hard truth sometimes. But can you offer some specifics on what do you do to really create inclusion? Because I think that's something people wrestle with, right? There's this tendency, to without meaning to. I mean, this isn't conscious, right? But there's just a tendency to hear more from people who sound like you and speak like you and look like you, and it's just harder work to genuinely seek out people who have a difference of some kind.
Yeah. And to really accept that things that seem so obvious to you. So you make a remark and it's a joke. I remember early on saying something about like, I hate February. And an African-American employee heard me. I wasn't talking to him, but he heard me and really thought February is Black History Month. Why is she saying that? And when I first heard that, this was now years ago, I was just completely dismissive. Like, oh, come on. Now, today, I would say, look, there really are different ways of thinking about February. You can think about the weather, the lack of light, but I am also now aware, which I never was, that it is Black History Month and that every year this is a chance for us to lift up people who were never acknowledged as part of our history. So that's just one tiny example of where I've had to accept the things that I literally dismissed. I'll give you another example where seven African-American women left New America over the space of about a year and a half. This was a number of years ago. And this was brought to my attention. And my reaction was, I don't know any other think tank in Washington that has 7 African-American women. So I took it immediately as, well, we're trying, we're doing the right thing. Today, I would listen and say, no, that means we're bringing people in, but we do not have the culture that actually makes people feel comfortable and valued. And so, we're now on what we call a 3-year equity transformation. Some of it is well known in the business world, where it really it's not training so much as organizational facilitation. So this is not a training. What we've done is once every month, for 2 hours. All of us come together with a consultant on diversity, equity, inclusion who's advising us. But what we've done is to break people into small groups and have them talk about a shared vocabulary. What does a microaggression mean to you? So that individuals could really talk to one another and hear from one another. At the same time, we are changing our hiring practices and more than our hiring practices, really thinking about what is best practice in terms of inclusion. But even beyond that, and this is where I think so many of us struggle, my president now, Paul Butler, who's an African-American man, actually half Filipino, half African-American. When I hired him, he said one of the things he does when he talks about DEI is to ask people, who are the 10 most important people in your life outside your family that you would call if there's any issue? And he said, think about those people. Are any of them not of your race? The answer was no for me. And the answer is no for most people I know. And that's where, as we have actually diversified, it's not just about your colleague, it's about making friends, that, developing enough trust that you can have conversations that can be brutally hard. But they're the same things as you and I might have, Rita, if we'd grown up together, where I could say, Rita, you did this and this is how I interpreted it, or this is what other people think. So it's a lot of really nitty gritty, hard personal work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and back to this connection between the personal and the national. I'm involved with a number of different projects. And one of the things that I guess as I get older, I realize is how many barriers are very subtle to people who are, intelligent, capable, competent, whatever. But it takes more than that, right? My parents were German. They came to this country with like $50 between them and a trunk and a lot of hopes and dreams, but they happened to be white. And so the skids were totally greased, next stop was Yale, then it was Xerox, then it was, and on and on and on. There were that kind of barrier didn't exist. There were others that did. And it's no discredit to them at all what they accomplished, which was phenomenal, but they didn't have a lot of these barriers that would have just stopped it right from the get-go. And I think that's something that it's taken a while to appreciate, just how real those things are.
I think that's right. And many of us who've gone to those fancy schools now look around and we see, lots of students of color in those fancy schools. And so we say, well, so now
problem solved, right?
But then realizing, I think about it sometimes, suppose I'd gone to Howard, right? And there's a whole set of cultural practices and histories and assumptions that I don't have. And how am I going to get them in an environment that may not feel hostile, but it's certainly going to feel different. And I'm going to be constantly aware of my difference. And, so it's the first step, of course, is admission, but that is not the same as really absorbing different contributions and different cultures into an environment. And that's where, again, one of the reasons I wrote this book now, the United States will be a plurality nation by the 2040s. And by 2027, Americans under 30, there will be no white majority. So our younger people are indeed growing up in a very different nation than the one you and I grew up in. And these skills, this ability, this way of thinking, this work is critical for our national, certainly our national thriving, if not surviving.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is tricky because, human beings are naturally kind of tribal, and there was a period back in Paleolithic times when that actually contributed to survival. So, I'm not saying that it's universally a negative thing, but it does require more work. I think that's one of the things. So you talk in the book about rushing towards criticism, and that's particularly intriguing. And I don't know about you, but as a professor, right, you get a lot of feedback. Not all of it is welcome. And I know, like in my classes, I could have 98 out of 100 people say I walk on water and create lamps out of nothing, and it's miraculous. And 2 people will say, well, yeah, you kind of flip foils too much, and blah, blah, blah. And I'll write in on why did you say that? And what did you mean?
Exactly.
So how do you develop the I guess the willingness, first of all, but then the insistence on getting that necessary criticism, getting that feedback, because it really, I do believe it's the only way you really do. You know, you need to have that provocation in order to shift what you're doing. And there's a lot of work actually been done on human imagination, which also reflects that, you know, if things are just sort of the same as we expected, our brains just lays along, you know, they don't get activated. It's only when we run into something that's counterfactual or that contradicts what we previously believed that our brains kind of go, hang on, what's that?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that piece. But so yes, the first chapter after the introduction is called Run Toward the Criticism. And I tell the story of when I was in this crisis, and it escalated really, really fast. And suddenly I realized, wow, we're in trouble. The organization's in trouble, and I'm the leader, so I'm in trouble. And I call David Bradley, then the publisher of The Atlantic, and on my board, he'd recruited me to run New America. And we're talking, and we knew I was in trouble. He's not sugarcoating that. And he says, run toward the criticism. And then he says, just like you're describing with your student evaluations, he says, imagine if you're having an argument with your spouse, and it's clear to you that your spouse is 98% wrong about whatever this argument is. And all of us have had those arguments. But maybe, you know, there's a nagging voice in the back of your head that says, maybe your spouse is 2% right. Maybe you didn't hang up your jacket. Maybe you did leave the dishes in the sink. Maybe, you know, maybe you didn't tell them that you were going out that night, all of that stuff. And he says, run toward that 2%. So even if, as you say, everything else is fine, this is how you're going to grow, is to run toward that 2%. So that's advice you can imagine putting in an advice manual and telling your kids. And believe me, my kids are already now telling me, Mom, you wrote a book about run toward the criticism, so you should listen to my criticism. Developing it as a practice is hard. And I actually called every single board member and asked them to tell me what they thought I'd done wrong. And it was really hard. And I found ways to ask staff as well. And I mean, I'm not perfect, and I also don't think you should take all criticism. And this is particularly true where you know that you feel that the criticism is really coming from a place of bias. So, you know, if I'm getting criticized for having sharp elbows, and I know that women leaders who are effective are often criticized for having sharp elbows, I'm not going to take that in. I'll register that person thinks it, but I may not change my behavior. So you have to use a guide, but I do think if you can start thinking to yourself, every time I hear really good feedback, criticism, that's an opportunity for me, not just to do something better, but to reflect and grow. You know, that's sort of the growth mindset, but it's more than the standard growth mindset. It's really, as you said, a way of recognizing that falling down is, you know, how do we learn to walk? We fall down and we get up and we adjust.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's one of the things that, just aside from the personal, I write about this a lot with respect to uncertainty. And a lot of my work's around innovation and strategy. And the reality of genuine uncertainty is you don't know. Yeah. That means you don't know. It means you don't know. And so the only
really
way
don't know.
Like people look at me sometimes when I say that, and it's like it's thunderingly obvious, but at the same time, it's like, wait a minute, what? And so the only way you're going to go from not knowing anything at all to knowing something is you formulate a hypothesis and you go out and you try to test it and learn from that and get better. And it's astonishing to me how even today, when we really don't know, I mean, you know, it's January 2021, raging global pandemic, which we all thought was going to be done, you know, a year and a half ago. And, you know, social justice crisis, environmental crisis, the list goes on. And yet, even amidst so much uncertainty, I know so many people that will take a position, you know, the number's 43, and then they will go to their deaths defending this position without recognizing we really don't know. So I think the freeing yourself from having to be right is hugely empowering. At least it can be.
No, exactly. And because it's so often, it's such a false security. Yet knowing, you know, sort of the only thing that is certain is the certainty of change, right? But knowing that you've got the tools to navigate the uncertainty, and this is the other thing I write about, that you are not alone in this. My biggest change in the way I lead is to lead much more collectively and collaboratively, which I'd written about forever because I'm a network theorist and I think about horizontal structures, but I wasn't really sharing leadership. I wasn't really thinking about New America is led by, yes, I'm the CEO and there's a president and there are vice presidents, but actually we are a group of people and we are responsible and we need to take account of many, many others. And so it isn't all on me. And that's deeply reassuring in times of uncertainty or even presumed certainty, because I used to really think it's on me to have the vision and to get people to follow it. And some of that's true. I mean, I have a lot of ideas and they pay me to, to kind of grow the organization and achieve our mission. But that sense of, hey, we're not alone, I have found to be transformative in not only the way I lead, but how I feel about leading.
I love that. I absolutely love that. One of the things I've been working on is something I'm coming to call the permissionless organization. And it doesn't mean that there are no guardrails, right? You have to be clear on the mission and the guardrails and what's sort of in bounds and what's out of bounds. But once you're in that sort of structure, how do you free people up to be able to act independent of being told what to do or asking permission or needing to get verification? And I really think that's going to be a hallmark of successful organizations going forward, because first of all, nobody at the top actually knows what's going on. I mean, the reality of most organizations is the farther away you get from the coalface, the less you know. And so this idea that the person at the top of a hierarchy knows what's going on and can confidently give orders and everybody else just executes, I mean, that's just very out of date, I think, and not reflective of reality, if it ever was. I don't think it ever was. But I do think this notion of collaboratively leading as a way of energizing the organization.
Exactly.
And it flows into things like agile and other kinds of leadership structures. And you have a whole book, a chapter in the book on sharing power.
Yes, because I did it very formally by taking CEO. I was president and CEO, and it dawned on me, there's Tyra. She was my executive vice president. She was ready to lead. She was ready to be a president. And it dawned on me, she's going to be a president somewhere else because she's going to get poached very quickly. Or I can make her my president and I can actually split my job. And it was the best thing I had done, because suddenly I had a partner. My board did not want us to be co-CEOs. They wanted it to be clear to the outside world that I was still CEO, which is fine. In practice, we were co-CEOs and we had this group of vice presidents. And it did take, it wasn't easy. I write about the first meeting that she led. I was physically sidelined. I really was sidelined. I was sitting on the side of the table, not at the head of the table, and she's leading the meeting. And I'm thinking, what have I done? What have I done? But of course, there are many things she was better at than I am. And again, I had a partner. And I also think at a time where we need to diversify the ranks of power, looking for places where you can split jobs, where you can make co-directors. Maybe you don't always have co-CEOs, or you can take a job where somebody had two titles and make that and split that, is a way of creating more high leadership opportunities for people who otherwise are going to have to wait a long time. And again, for right now, it's been indispensable to lead with somebody who doesn't look like me, because we've got a workforce that doesn't look like me. And it's not that, having an African-American or a Latinx partner doesn't mean they always know what to do. There are huge generational differences here too, but it helps.
Yeah, I'm very reminded of, so like you, we're much of the same generation, and I graduated from Barnard, in 1981, and I was going to power on down to Wall Street, with the puffy shoulders, the string ties, and it was Abbott and somebody was like the iconic advertising icon of the time, and our heroines then were like Betty Friedan and people like that. I'm reminded of this because our daughter recently, within the last 2 weeks, sent me an article, and the article was entitled "The Problem with White Women," and I was like, "Are you speaking to me?" Excuse me.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, but the article, and it makes a similar point, which is that for many of us, the sort of battle for equality kind of began and ended with gender equality. And I think we're now realizing that's it's not a bad place to start, but it's not at all where we need to end. And I think that was kind of an interesting point. So I would love to get you to reflect a little on careers, because one of the things that you have done remarkably well is transition from multiple kinds of careers. And I think that's more and more the way that we're going to sort of construct our lives. And a lot of people find that very scary. The idea of leaving behind, for example, leaving behind a tenured professorship to go do something different. I mean, I know a lot of people, certainly in my world, who would never even think of that. It's like once they get tenure, that's it. That's life. And I've always thought that was a kind of a crazy way to think. But there are people that's what they want, right? That they don't feel secure unless they have that guarantee. So, talk a little bit about, because you've made multiple transitions, and you've talked about odysseys in your journey, and maybe reflect on what gave you the confidence to do that.
Well, the first thing to say is it was very scary, and one of the things I say is, and I tell people this, that if you are not terrified when you're moving on to something next, you're not out of your comfort zone enough. I mean, it's so something where I wasn't leaving. When I became director of policy planning, I'd been the dean of the School of Public and International Affairs. So I'd been in a leadership position. I'd never been in government. This is 2009, and I'm about 50 years old. And I go to the State Department. The State Department's the size of a Washington city block. It's the biggest building I've ever seen. And I am supposed to be reporting directly to the Secretary of State and leading 40 people I've never seen before in a system I've never been in. And all I wanted to do was go back home and curl up in fetal position with my blanket over my head. Right? It's just, so I say, your stomach, if your stomach hurts, that you're really pushing. So I partly, it's not that there's no way to do this without a lot of fear. It's, again, how do you respond to that fear? I think the answer is, in the end, I am happiest, maybe not day to day, minute to minute, but certainly over month to month, year to year, when I feel like I'm still growing. So I was a law professor. I never expected to be a law professor. There was a lot of learning there, and learning how to write articles and learning what I was teaching. But after 12 years, I felt like I've kind of got this, I know. And if I keep doing it, I will grow, but I'm going to grow along the same path. Jumping from that to being a dean was really different. And again, I had to lead faculty members. I'd never done any of that. Really scary, very hard, made tons of mistakes, but felt like now I've mastered this set of skills. Same with government. And leaving academia was really tough. And there are plenty of times, particularly since my husband's still a professor, when June rolls around and he's got the summer, I just think, what was I thinking? But again, I felt I didn't want to rise in university administration, because I didn't want to be a university president and a full-time manager. And that is what being a university president is. And I realized I'm really an entrepreneur at heart. I love making things happen. I know you're the same way. And so, again, moving to New America was, I'm going to grow as a leader, but also I'd been a foreign policy person all my life. And yet, while I was in government, and just as a citizen, I was looking around at the state of the infrastructure of this country, our railroads, our education system, our healthcare system, and feeling like we have to fix ourselves at home if we're going to play the role that I've always advocated we play in the world. So there too was a lot of growth. So I think it takes courage, but it's courage of a particular kind that sort of knows you're going to be afraid and knows you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and just says, that's how I learn and grow. And in the end, I'll be happy that I learned and grew.
Mm-hmm. And I think also for a lot of people, they don't realize that, like, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah, that's the other thing.
I mean, one of my friends is a woman named Sharon John, who's the current CEO of Build-A-Bear Workshop, and I know Clark is on your board. And she'll talk about, asking for a raise or, looking for a more bigger opportunity. And she says, well, what's the worst that can happen? Somebody will say no.
Yeah.
Or at least they know now that you're interested, right? And so I think a lot of people build up in their minds fears that are not actually real?
Yes.
And they don't ask that question. So let's talk a little bit about women. And in the book, you talk about dangerous women, kind of leading us towards a world where we get rid of e pluribus unum and we sort of talk about plures et unum. And I'd love you to connect those ideas, because one of the things I think is, and you've written about this as well, for a lot of us, there's this sort of male life cycle model that we've sort of embedded in our world, right? Which is in your 20s, you sort of figure out who you are. In your 30s, you're either high potential or you're also ran. In your 40s, you sort of seize the reins of power. Your 50s, you're allowed one blonde and a Corvette, and then you gig to the next generation. And like that totally doesn't work for women, like not at all. And so in my view, we need a completely different life cycle model for how we build careers as professional women.
Completely. Oh, I so agree. And honestly, if we want men equally engaged in family life, as we should, if we want choices about how you balance career and family to be based on personality and opportunity, not on gender, then this should be a life cycle for men too. But for women, absolutely. I cite Elizabeth Cady Stanton writing Susan B. Anthony, and it's great. She says, but in a couple of years, I'll be 50. My 6 kids will be behind me, and I'll be entering my prime, right? And so, and for her prime then is what many women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Madeleine Albright, the women just 10 years ahead of you and me, or 15 years ahead of you and me, who had their kids pre-1970s and then entered the workforce in their 40s. They made a whole career post kids. And now I think often what it's you get the education, you get started at least in one career, you have kids, but not everybody does, and however you construct your family, and there's going to be a period where you're going to move laterally for a while. You don't fall back necessarily, and you'll grow in various ways. But then this period, yes, when your kids are grown, where you have another set of opportunities. And even later, and I got dangerous women from Pat Mitchell, who in her late 70s is still driving things, building things, making things happen. And what she points out is later in your 60s, there's this wonderful freedom of just not caring what people think anymore. You don't have to care physically what they think. I mean, you want to take care of yourself, but you also just have this sense that your life is yours to shape. Again, this is a privileged narrative. And one of the things I write about is you and I don't have that far to fall, because we've got a lot of privilege. But I think that's right. And what I've looked at is that it has been white women, but now it doesn't have to be. It just has to be older women, often women at that stage of our lives. We've got energy, we're willing to take risks, and we have a really particular role to play in this country right now, right? We can, and I think we are. We're pushing to build a whole infrastructure of care. We're insisting in many ways that we join with younger people to change hierarchies. But we have energy and time. And if we can learn how to engage with our daughters and granddaughters in ways that don't make us totally out of touch, there's a lot we can do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So talk a little bit about the 2026 vision, because you end the book with it's 250 years after this, what many people think of as the founding of this country occurred. What would we like to see happen by then?
Yeah. So I'm deeply engaged in thinking about 2026, because in 1976, we had the bicentennial, and I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I grew up, staffing a bicentennial booth at the University of Virginia, as everybody expecting Thomas Jefferson to just walk in at any moment. And it was a very triumphalist celebration. I remember Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip came, and there were tall ships in New York.
Oh yeah, the ships. Boston. I remember that.
Exactly. And we'd been through Watergate and Vietnam. You'd think we would have had a little navel gazing, but oh no, this was 200 years of the great nation. And indeed, it's 200 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. As you said, that is not really the founding of the nation, certainly not for Indigenous Americans, but not for African Americans and many others. But it is this moment where we become a nation among nations under international law, as an international lawyer. In 2026, it's a cut. We're on the hinge. We're at the end of our first quarter millennium. So what are we going to look like when we turn 500? Right? And we'll be a very different nation for those next 250 years, assuming we survive, because we will not have a white majority. And so when I say, yes, instead of e pluribus unum, out of many one, we should be pluribus et unum, many and one, because we really are going to be. Of course, we always were. Each state, had a different religion. And, it's not like the founding fathers were all the same, but they sure were more alike than the country today. And so I think we can use this moment, this deadline, but also as a catalyst to say, what is our vision of the country for the next 250 years, or maybe just the next 50, right? Or depending how old you are, the next 10. But what is it? Let's get out of all the things we don't have and that we're in danger of losing. Michael Gerson just wrote a wonderful piece where he said, the left is afraid that we're losing democracy and the right is afraid that we're losing the country. All of that is prophesied loss. What about the vision of what we could be? And can we use 2026 to get people looking up, and forward, as opposed to at one another across this horrible, bitter divide?
And you recently wrote an op-ed in the Times, I think it was last week, right? It came out
Monday, yeah. It seems like last week. I agree.
But it was about bigger resolutions. And I thought that was very apt for the beginning of the year. And certainly for those of us engaged in trying to think through, what do we do about things like inequality, all right? Yeah. Which is, to me, just the seeds of so much that's just catastrophically wrong. We're so out of balance. And you see that flowing through business decisions and in corporate boardrooms and in the way that money appears in our politics. And, it just is the seeds of so much that's so wrong. And yet it seems like an intractable problem, but maybe not. We've solved it before.
We have. And I remind people that 100 years ago, 1920 is in between the first wave of changes that happened under both Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, but to harness in the terrible inequalities of the Gilded Age, right? And then going on to the New Deal. But we have made dramatic changes, political and social changes before. And what I was arguing was, you have to think big even to make small change. And I just use the example of, you want to lose 10 pounds. You can't go on a diet. You've got to change your lifestyle. And to change your lifestyle required lots of associated changes and will affect others. And similarly, what we need to do is to really look to what we want to see as a nation. And I'll give you a very concrete example. I want a multi-party democracy. I do not think the Democrats and the Republicans, where they have no overlap, can represent the people of this country. And yet we are locked into a majoritarian two-party system where you can win without a majority, right? As long as I beat you, as long as I have more votes than you do, because there are only two parties, I win. Well, that doesn't have to be. We can change our electoral system at the state level very easily, and states are already doing it. So think about something big like that, and then think, okay, so what has to change? There, you can join the many people who are either creating a new party, as they're doing in California right now, the Common Sense Party, or work to adopt ranked choice voting in your state, as Maine and Alaska have done. Or you might think about education, and you might say, you know what? We actually have to get rid of an education system based on property taxes. This is crazy. No other country in the world does this, and this dooms people. If you're already poor, you're going to get a bad education. So there are people working on that. It won't, just like losing the 10 pounds, you can't say, oh, this time next year, we're not going to have an educational system based on property taxes. You can figure out, here are the small changes that have to happen. or the same thing with an infrastructure of care. So what I think we need, we are bold, vigorous, inventive people, right? That is, I really believe that. And I'm half European. I spent a lot of time in Europe. I love it. But the energy here is tremendous if it is harnessed, again, not at hating one another, but really thinking about what we want together and how we can achieve it.
Mhm. I love that. I absolutely love that. So it's been nearly 10 years since that famous Atlantic article that landed you like on everybody's doorstep in the country about women can't have it all. And it went viral and it provoked all this conversation and I think healthy conversation. And I think it was, it was timely because I think what happened to a lot of women was they, like, if they were struggling, they kind of felt firstly alone and secondly, like they'd failed somehow, like other people are having it all. Why can't I? I think it was kind of a simultaneously sort of a force that some people took very negatively, like, oh, don't you're such a downer, and other people were just met it with relief. What's changed since then?
Yeah, it's hard to believe that it will be a decade in June.
I know.
And I've been thinking about whether I will write something. A lot has changed, but a lot that has changed has also highlighted the deep structural problems that remain. So what has changed is partly that, yes, a lot of people, a lot of my crowd, our crowd, the feminists I'd always grown up with, thought I'd betrayed the movement. Really, I mean, they did. They said, of course we know it's hard, and of course we know lots of people drop out, but you can't admit that. For one thing, men won't hire women. You're taking us backwards. And second, you'll discourage younger women. And my response was, look, younger women are not stupid. They are looking at how many people, started, as women still do, equal or larger numbers in business school, law school, med school. And then as the hierarchy rises, they fall off to almost nothing. And so that is no longer true. I think there's now a real recognition that, yeah, you can only get so far playing the game exactly the way men do. It is time to say that, if we ran the world from the beginning, you'd have had paid family leave long ago. You'd have had a different career cycle, as you and I just talked about. You would have really good childcare and elder care. And even more importantly, you'd recognize care. You'd recognize investing in the next generation as critical social work. This is one place where the Scandinavians really have it right. They understand that you're not going to have the country you need unless you invest in your children. And that's not just education, that's really enabling human connection, right? Strong families, again, however constructed. Now we have Biden has a care agenda. Ai-jen-poo, when she was talking about an infrastructure of care in 2012, nobody. That was a tiny number of people who were listening. No longer. So there are a lot of things that really have shifted. And I now talk about care feminism and career feminism and how they have to go together. And we, I think, understand that men have to change their roles. But against all that, look at what has happened during the pandemic. It's just, it made me so crazy. And I can't remember who wrote it in the New York Times. She said she was so angry that she was screaming, but she was exhausted, that we were more worried about bars opening than schools opening. Mm-hmm. And of course, various countries had kept schools open and daycares open. And so it was, again, this assumption that everybody can go back home. And who did the care work at home? Men did more, but women in the end were the ones responsible. And now we still can't get paid family leave through, right? Joe Manchin says he doesn't want any part of it. And that's where you just think, look, we're half the population. Without us, the economy tanks. Without us, we don't have half the great ideas that will innovate and do all the other good things. We're still run by men.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Aviva Wittenberg-Cox writes about this, and she's written very articulately about something that's actually happening. And we're not talking about it in terms of feminism, which is a baby bust. By 2023, there will be literally 1 million fewer kids born than would have been born given normal trajectories. And, I bring this up in business meetings all the time. And I'm like, so if you're, Procter and Gamble, or you're Unilever, or you're, the New York Times or something, has it occurred to you that like 1 million fewer potential customers is actually quite material? And if that continues, like, and they look at me in boardrooms like, what are you talking about, babies in the boardroom? I'm like, because at the end of the day, if you don't
grow up, haven't you noticed?
like generally the number of 10-year-olds there will be 10 years from now depend on how many people born. Like, as a general rule, that's kind of how it works. So Aviva talks about women literally voting with their wombs, and we're seeing this as a global phenomena. And I think and we have definitely seen it where, when women are given access to education and opportunity, that they are more than capable of taking advantage of those things. But we make it structurally so difficult that, it just, people stop, right? They give up.
We've still got a system that was created for single wage earners with a full-time caregiver at home, and we keep trying to tweak that system. That system is, going to be a century old soon. We need to wipe it out and start over with a system that assumes all human beings are going to have caregiving and breadwinning responsibilities in different proportions, and some will choose all one and all the other. But that's a radically different proposition to get started.
Well, and it also, when you talk about having it all, I mean, my coda to that is always not all at once.
Yep.
There are going to be years when, you're just got preoccupations with some other thing, and then years where you really have productive time. And if I think about something like doing a PhD, I mean, that's 4 years when you really don't have a lot of bandwidth to do a lot of other things. But having that behind you, that sets you up for a whole different.
You must have been a star. I love the fact that you said 4 years. Most of us say 7.
Well, I had the both the luxury and the penalty of being in a business program. Yeah. They don't like you hanging out there for too long. But yeah, it was 4 years. Our son was 6 months old when I started, and our daughter was born when I was starting to work on my thesis. So in a way, it was great. I mean, I could, I worked 80 hours a week, but at least it could be the 80 that
we're flexible, right? That's no, and at that age, you can do it. I did the same.
Yeah, I look back and like, to this day, I cannot. I look back and I can tell you the schedule, but I don't know how I did it. I couldn't do it now. Right. So the other thing that I just wanted to add to this sort of one breadwinner for a whole family kind of thing, the other dirty little secret that corporate America doesn't like to talk about is, back in the day when that was sort of the middle class aspiration, we also paid people well enough that was possible. That no longer is the case for the vast majority of people. You need both breadwinners working to keep a family afloat. And I think we don't talk about that part of the equation at all. Women came into the workforce partly because of that. Because there started to be a lot more pressure on what a single wage earning man could earn. And I think that's a piece of the equation we don't talk about enough.
No, it's enormous. I mean, much of the economic growth from the 70s forward was adding that second income, because wages were stagnant, but the second income meant you could then maintain a middle class life, until that's not true even now, right? You can have both people working and just not making enough to support a family, to support a middle class life. I mean, this is again where ultimately we all have to join the fight. There's a note in the chat about describing the new roles of men. This is, you can't have women take on men's work and still do all the work they traditionally did, and men only do the work men traditionally did. Men have to take on the work that women traditionally did. And again, this can be a matter of personality. I know deeply nurturing men and deeply competitive women, and there's the spectrum, and I'm both, and my husband is both, and we have we balance it out that way. But we as workers, right, have to say, look, in a society, you have to be able to connect work to gain. You have to be able to see that if you play by the rules, you will have a life in which you can have a family, you can have a nice life. Your children will at least have the same advantages you did. We are now looking at a whole generation that are downwardly mobile, because the wages, that gap between the few that have so much and the many that have so little is not just limited to traditional middle class, it's also upper middle class. So there has to be a kind of, here's what we need. We need to raise our families. We need to care for our parents, care for those we need to care for. And we need wages for whoever's working that will allow you to put together a family life that allows both work and care. And that, again, as I said, is really, it's not starting over, but it's a much bigger change than we've been prepared to make. And I'm deeply hoping that the Great Resignation is going to be a big part of that catalyst, because I think as employers realize that they just can't survive on the wages that they've been paying people they can't hire, they're going to start pushing, I hope, for lowering the cost of living through universal health care and cheaper education, but and also a different wage base.
Yeah, and I'm very much on that page as well. So one of the people I work with a lot is Zainab Tan at MIT.
Yeah.
Who's doing all this great work around good jobs. And
Yep.
and ironically, we always think of the wages people get paid as a cost, right? Which I think is a big mistake, because humans are ingenious and inventive creatures. And if you can enlist them in your cause, you can increase your top line. And we never look at that, And I've written a ton of stuff about this, but I think that's so.
I'm taking that in as a CEO. That's so smart. Of course, that's right. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And what's also fascinating to me, and you speak about the Great Resignation, is the data on people that are burned out and disengaged at work, and it's massive. I think the latest number was something like 45% of people are not engaged, and it's not necessarily that they're hostile, but they feel overworked, underappreciated, burned out, just cynical, listless. Take this job and whatever. And I do hope that's a sea change. We're all having our Johnny Paycheck moments, right? And I do hope it's a bit of a sea change. And one of the fascinating things to me has been the whole conversation around back to the office or not. And what I find fascinating about this and so many other social policies is people who are experts presume to know what the best thing is for other people. And I really think the smartest thing we can do is let small groups of coworkers figure it out, because it's going to be different for every combination of humanity, that what works and what doesn't. And I think that's probably going to be the best solution, because again, this is one of those situations where we don't know, like we have no data on what works and what doesn't. We have a lot of assumptions.
And people, so I'm in the midst of this. We have 150 people, 204 floors in a big building next to the White House. And, even when I go into the office, which I started doing in the fall, I was there with 12 other people. But, they're young people who really want to come back into the office because they're alone. They're in, apartments, maybe shared apartments. It's not a luxurious working environment. And they need to meet other people, right? And hang out with people. And then, of course, they're the parents who would be quite happy as long as as long as schools are open, to have the flexibility of working much closer to home. And then there are lots of individual preferences. So I think of this, and I wrote this yesterday in a memo to my team, that we need to lean into the future of work and stop thinking about back to the office, and not even the new normal. It's, what are the opportunities here and how can we embrace them? What do we need, right? If I were to abolish the office, I'd spend a lot of money on retreats, because we need to be able to come together. And some teams really spark off each other much more than others and really do better in physically. Others have been distributed for a long time. So I think your idea about experimenting, but also just accept, if the pandemic had ended in 6 months to a year, I think we'd have gone back. It's going to be, who knows, it could be 4 years, because there's still going to be variants, and there's still going to be people who are really worried about, infecting older people or immunocompromised people. Let's just grab this as reinventing what work's going to be.
Mhm. Well, and I do think this is a moment of great unfreezing, which I guess is, as we're getting toward the end of our time, a great thing to kind of reflect on. So New America Foundation, big important think tank, your own work and writing and so forth. How can people get engaged, learn more, support you?
Oh, well, by all means, you could definitely support us. So it's New America, and we are a think tank, but we're also, I don't like think and action tank, but what we say is we produce 4 things. We produce policies. We think about things like student loans and trying to get universities to actually make their data transparent about everything from tuition to where their graduates go, cutting student loan debt, all sorts of good policies, political reform, work and family, which we think of as care and just having a better life. We do some global work. We do a ton of tech work. So policies, and we're also a platform, and all of our events are free and you can sign up for them and they're terrific. But we're really also working on what we think of as products and practice, which is not usual for a think tank. But we are convinced that in the end, if you just take unemployment insurance or COVID benefits, those have to get to the people that they're supposed to help, and they have to get to them fast. And many people were trying to get unemployment benefits over the past 2 years who discovered the disaster of the systems at the state level and the federal level. And so we are really thinking about, how does democracy deliver? Right? How do you really get in there and work with state officials to fix really broken systems? Minnesota has 9 different programs to help young children. Well, that's great, but can you imagine being a parent navigating? So Minnesota wants to do that better, which is wonderful. So you can help us by participating and engaging with us on our website, coming to our events. You can also figure out areas where you're really interested and look to see what kind of work is being done in those areas, and support us both financially, but also in terms of connecting us to people that we need to be connected to.
That's great. That's great. And a great moment to ring. It might have been a white moment, right? Great book, really worth a read, and not a heavy book. I mean, a personal, occasionally very fun, real book. And so I encourage you to perhaps pick that up. Visit the New America Foundation's website and support their work. And Anne-Marie, how delightful to connect with you from so far away.
I know, exactly. Well, I hope next time in person over lunch. And
absolutely,
it was really a lot of fun and a great way to end.
Good connecting with you, and to be continued.
Indeed. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.